Hi everyone. In this video, we're going to be looking at the beginning of Activity 3, importing and exporting data with R. This is a bit of a long activity, so it's going to be broken up into multiple videos. So in this activity, we're going to learn how to import CSV files into R, comma-separated value files, how we can import other special data file types into R, and how we can also write data from R, export data outside of R. So the first thing we're going to do is open up a new R Markdown document and knit it. In any of the major, the three main output file formats work for this activity, PDF, HTML, or Word. Since Blackboard accepts PDF documents the easiest, let's do a new R Markdown knitting to PDF. Let's call it Activity 3. So let's knit. Okay. All right, and when you knit, it should automatically open up a PDF viewer of that PDF document. All right. Okay. So now that we've created a R Markdown file, knitting to PDF, let's start by loading these packages here. So we're going to copy this code. And then in RStudio Workbench, after the setup chunk, we're going to get rid of all this and then insert a new chunk, which again, you can do with the Insert Chunk button or the shortcut Control-Alt-I or Command-Alt-I. And paste that code in here. Now you likely see some message right away about this or that package is not installed yet. So we're going to go ahead and click Install and let RStudio install these packages that are not yet available. If there's any other packages that are not available, although these look good to go now. Yep, those are actually good to go. But if you run this and get an error about error, no package, for example, the error might look like this. If you tried to load a package that doesn't exist, you might see an error that says error library and then the package name. There is no package called that. What you need to do, if that's the case, is then run install.packages, the name of the package that you were trying to do in the console, and then click enter. And this manually installs the package that you would need. There's no actual package called fig package, but just for these R packages that we're using today, you may need to do that if you get this type of error. But for the most part, installing it using the window that popped up and what's already available in RStudio, for the most part, we should be good to go. If you need more than one package to be installed at once in RStudio, you can also use install.packages and then a vector of the package names with lowercase c like this. This creates a vector. And then you do the package names separated by quotes that you want to install all at once. But again, this would only be an issue, something you'd need to do if loading these with the library command didn't work right away. Then you may need to install potentially multiple missing packages like this, using which you could do efficiently with this single call of install.packages and then clicking enter in the console here. But again, in this setup, these packages are all already installed. So we make sure to click the green Run Current Chunk button, and we are good to go. Right. So starting with a discussion of CSV files. So CSV again stands for comma-separated value files. And they're one of the most common ways in which data files are stored. So here's an example of a CSV file available via the website GitHub. And this is what it looks like in its raw form. So it has values that are separated by commas, very aptly named. The first row of a CSV file is typically the column names or variable names, and the subsequent rows contain the actual values or observations for the data. Sometimes it's the case that the first row already jumps right into the values, which is not as nice to see because typically you want to know what the variables are called, what the column should be named. But in this case, they are already labeled. There's variable names contained in this CSV file. Yeah. There's a preview of that same data set we just opened up there. So the most common way to read in a data file from a CSV file into R is to use the read.csv function, which is what we would call a base R function, because it's available in R actually without loading any additional packages. This function is always available. So first, we will import the possum.csv data directly from the URL using the read.csv function. We can copy that. And then we'll add a new chunk, read.csv. We're going to create a data set called possums. Like this. We do the assignment operator. And then inside read.csv, we're going to put in between quotes the URL to the data set. Or alternatively, if you have a file on your machine, you give the file path in here inside this string. Here's the URL. Paste it in there, which again was in the activity as well. You could copy it from here. Yeah. It's the same. And then we can run that. You see, after we ran that code, that chunk of code, it creates an object in our global environment. So this data set, which we called possums, is showing up here, and we can click on it to view it in the viewer up here. So we can see there are 104 observations or rows in this data set and 14 variables or columns. So the viewer is a nice way to get acquainted with the data set after you import it typically. It allows you to look at all the columns, scrolling back and forth, similar to opening a data set up in Excel, except you can't modify these values in the viewer in R. We're just looking at them. Some helpful things you can do. You can hover over a variable to see the type. In this case, it's a numeric type variable, and its smallest value is 1, and its largest value is 9. So this data set is on possums. So the youngest possum was 1 year old, and the oldest was 9 years old. So that's helpful to know. Right, sometimes it doesn't tell you as much. It might just say character. But that's a useful thing we can do with the viewer. You can also click on the variable names to sort the whole data set by that variable. And you can click again to sort from largest to smallest or smallest to largest. Okay. And note that that does not modify the data set in our environment, our global environment. It's just modifying the viewer pane over here, how we're viewing this data set. So next, after we imported it into R, we'll now print the first 5 rows of the data using the slice head function and the first 6 columns of the data using the select function. So we'll copy this code below. And before actually we paste it into R here, if you knit the document, take a look at what that looks like. And you'll likely notice, if you look at the resulting knitted document, you'll see some extra messages here. And we might want to suppress some of these when the libraries are being loaded. So if we want to do that, one way to suppress some of those messages, which are not problematic, it's just sort of extra information, we can, in the global R chunk, or the setup R chunk, we can set global chunk options here. So we can say message equals false to set the message chunk option to be false by default for all code chunks, and warning equals false. Now, if we knit that again and look at that, we'll see some of those messages went away. Okay. Which typically we wouldn't want to see all those extra messages in our document. All right, so back to what we were doing. Let's copy this code, and then we're going to paste this inside the chunk where we read in the data set, still inside the chunk here. So what this code is doing is a few things. First, we'll break it down by the first piece here. So the select function, you can look at the help file for this. The select function allows you to select a subset of columns from a data set. So here we're saying, take the possums data set, and this operator is called a pipe. Take the possums data set and pipe it into the select function. So we apply the select function to the possums data set and select the 1st through 6th columns. So if you ran that code in the console, you would see what that looks like. We have the 1st through the 6th column when we ran that code. Okay. Now next, we had some extra code before. Then we had this slice underscore head function. So what this line of code does is it says, apply the select function to the possums data set, keeping only the first 6 columns. Then, to the result of that, apply the slice head function and only take the first 5 rows. So select allows us to subset by columns. Slice head allows us to take the first n rows of a data set. And you can see that by looking at the help file for slice head here. Lastly, the cable function, which is from the knitr package, has a K because of knit_r, and then it's like a knit_r table. So they combined, sort of smushed those words together and called it a cable. This essentially prints the data set nicely into an output R markdown file. So if we knit or compile this document now, and then you look at that resulting document, here you see these 6 columns and first five rows of the data set. So here's the R code that we've used so far, and here's the resulting table output that was produced. So using read.csv is one way to import data directly into R. We can also use what's called the import wizard in order to use a more clickable way to import data sets into R. Okay. But to do that, we can't use a file based on its URL. We have to have the data file directly on our computer and import it from there. So the first thing we're going to do is download this CSV file, which we can manually do by going to this file, right-click and save as. We'll save it in our downloads, probably. And then we're going to upload that file to RStudio Workbench. If we click on Files, Upload, choose File, and then we'll navigate in this File Explorer to the file we want to upload, and click OK. And then it should show up in our Files pane now. So now we were able to import this data set from here using the import wizard. So to do this, we go File, and then click Import Dataset. And then we'll click From Text. Before I go further with that, so File, Import Dataset. Notice that there's different options here. So we can import data from a CSV file using either of these top two options. We can. So from text base and from text readr are for importing .csv and also .txt files. From Excel is how we can use the import wizard to import .xls and .xlsx files. SPSS, for those who took Stat 215, you may have had the pleasure of using SPSS. Those have their own proprietary file type for data files that have the file extension .sav. We can import those into R using the import wizard. And then there's also proprietary file types for data saved from SAS and Stata as well. So all of these are options here. To import the possum.csv dataset, we can use from text. And then we can navigate here to find the file, click open, and then import. And SAS automatically writes the code and submits it to the console. So you could import that into R in that way. Okay. So that's one way in which we can use the import wizard, adding some comments here that don't functionally do anything, but just make little notes about what the code's doing. All right. So we did that. We downloaded the CSV file, imported it into RStudio using the import wizard. And in the next video, we'll look at how we can handle large data sets when importing them into R.